So why is a Catholic from Seattle interested in Mormon history? My background is one of belief, dissent, and conversion, and then belief, dissent, and conversion all over again, with persecution thrown in from time to time. One branch of my mother's family included 7 generations of Church of England priests in Great Britain. Another branch left the established church and joined the Quakers, only to be persecuted. Her forebears came to America in colonial times and settled around Philadelphia. My mother was thus brought up half Episcopalian and half Quaker. 200 years after my mother's family came to America, my father's grandparents arrived from Scotland. Having deserted the Presbyterian faith of their birth, they converted to Mormonism in the 1840s in the Glasgow area, where they too encountered persecution. The family left Scotland in the early 1850s to gather with the Mormons in Utah. But 5 years after arriving, several branches lost their new faith and fled to California with the help of an army escort. More on that later. My line of that family later joined the Unitarians. Episcopalians, Quakers, Presbyterians, Mormons, Unitarians. Then came yet another conversion in the family. Although I was brought up in a congregational church, after reading Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountain in the early 1970s, I converted to Catholicism. There I have found a spiritual home and now help out in a 7-month class for those who want to become Catholic. Here in Mormon Studies, our little band of Catholics has taken the name Morlics, i.e. Mormons Catholics. We tried Cathmons, but Catholics Mormons didn't have the same ring. To return to the Mormon branches and how I got interested in them. My father's mother's family, the McCauslins, became disillusioned with Mormonism in the late 1850s. The causes were complex, but primarily stemmed from the excesses of the Mormon Reformation of 1856-57. Most disturbing for them were the preaching of blood atonement and the parish Potter murders in Springville 6 months before the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The parishes had been killed because they had lost their faith and were trying to go to California. By then, the McCauslins had also decided to leave, but it was not simple, 10 years before the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. They feared the Danites, Brigham Young's purported secret band of armed thugs. That there was danger for those who lost their faith is shown by the murder of the parishes, but whether the McCauslins were targeted is impossible to know. Nevertheless, their perception of peril was real. In 1858, the U.S. Army marched into Utah to install a non-Mormon governor and effect a separation of church and state. With others, the McCauslins applied to the new governor for help in getting out of Utah. Thus, in June 1859, some 40 families of disaffected Mormons left for California under the protection of an army escort. Soon after the McCauslins left, my father's paternal family, the Airds, moved to Heber City. There, William Aird, my great-grandfather, also became disillusioned. In 1873, 20 years after the family arrived in Utah, he told his priesthood quorum that while he still believed in Joseph Smith, he no longer believed in the Utah church authorities. He resigned from the quorum and withdrew from the church. Soon afterwards, he joined the reorganized Latter-day Saints, today's Community of Christ, another instance of belief, dissent, and conversion. William was a handloom weaver and made most of the cloth worn in Heber, but when he left the church, he lost his customers. The now persecuted family was soon starving. William's son, my grandfather, then 10 years old, later wrote that the hardest part, besides the constant hunger, was the taunting of other children. When the bishop, Abram Hatch, discovered their plight, he made sure the family received at least the barest necessities of life. Over time, attitudes changed and the family was accepted once more. About the time I started high school, my grandmother wrote an account of these family experiences. Years later, my father, in retirement, decided to expand her story by adding context. As I had been an editor for many years, he asked me to go over it. What a patchwork quilt. The family stories mixed in with Scottish history, Mormon history, Utah history, and Mormon beliefs. In trying to straighten it out, I became intrigued. Why had these Scots converted in the first place? What happened that disillusioned them? And did they fill the spiritual vacuum in their lives with something else? I knew nothing about Mormonism except what my grandmother and now my father had written, none of it very complimentary. Deciding to keep an open mind, I started reading and then ordering books through interlibrary loan. The first book I read was Wallace Stegner's The Gathering of Zion, the story of the Mormon Trail. First published in 1964, its final section, A Word on Bibliography, speaks of the problem for historians. Quote, "The literature on the Mormons is enormous, repetitious, contradictory, and embattled. The more one wades into this morass, the deeper he is mired, and the farther from firm ground. There is no firm ground here. There is only Mormon opinion, Gentile opinion, and the necessarily tentative opinion of historians trying to take account of all the facts and allow for all the delusion, hatred, passion, paranoia, lying, bad faith, concealment, and distortion of evidence that were contributed by both the Mormons and their enemies." Well, it looked pretty hopeless. Nevertheless, I wrote letters to the Utah State Historical Society, and then, bravely as I look back on it, to Leonard Arrington. Both were generous in their replies, with Arrington writing a long, single-spaced typed letter suggesting books and people I might contact. His letter gave me the courage to keep going. At the Historical Society, the then curator of manuscripts, Gary Topping, was likewise helpful. I decided I had to go to Utah and do primary research. After reading relevant records in the Historical Society and Family History Library, it became obvious that I needed to go to the church archives with their wealth of documents and diaries. I was hesitant, even afraid. I had Stegner's words in mind. Here was I, a Catholic and a descendant of people who had deserted the LDS faith, wanting access to records that involved painful parts of their history. It was now in the early 1990s, not that many years after Arrington's banishment to Provo. I had read his and David Spitten's book, Mormons and Their Historians, in which they said that many documents in the archives had become highly restricted. That fitted Stegner's description. I was sure I would not be allowed in. Gary Topping, however, said to go and introduce myself to Ron Watt, whom he knew through the Historical Society. Ron, he said, was as kind a person as one could hope to meet. Thus, with my heart in my mouth and no crucifix showing, I found my way to the second floor of the church office building and the archives. There I was confronted with a document to sign, giving the church the right to review anything I published that included material from their collection. I signed with trepidation, for there was no other way to get in. I asked for Ron Watt and introduced myself. To my relief, he was unreservedly friendly. It wasn't long before I discovered that everyone in the archives would go out of their way to help. Over the years, Ron Barney and Randy Dixon, in addition to Ron Watt, as well as many others inside and outside the archives, have patiently and cheerfully answered my questions, no matter how ignorant and off the wall they must have sounded. Since then, the church archives has become increasingly open and no longer insists on review rights. With the advent of Rick Turley, who's sitting right there, with the advent of Rick Turley as assistant church historian, many more records are now available. The helpfulness of the archive staff puzzled me. Why? Especially in light of the research I was doing. Bit by bit, I developed theories. Perhaps it was because Mormons are truly nice people. Or maybe they were intrigued by my project and curious to see what I might turn up. Or maybe they believed the truth would not hurt the church and felt my interest was not in bashing the church, but in figuring out what had happened to one family. But finally I thought, oh, they hope I will see how wonderful the church is and convert. Throughout this journey, the Mormon History Association has been my home. Lavina Fielding Anderson, in her gracious and welcoming way, regularly encouraged me and eventually asked me to join the editorial board of the Journal of Mormon History. The MHA conferences, and especially the tours, have made it possible to get to know many Mormons. Almost all have been warm and friendly, though curious about my involvement. The result of all this is that my first book, Mormon Convert, Mormon Defector, about the family that escaped with the help of the Army, was published in 2009. It was followed by a book edited with Will Bagley and Jeff Nichols titled Playing with Shadows, Voices of Dissent in the Mormon West, which includes 4 previously unpublished journals or autobiographies of 19th century Mormons who had difficulties with church authorities. I've also written several papers and served on the executive board of the MHA. In the process, I've become somewhat of a specialist on 19th century Mormon dissenters. I certainly had no idea that this is where I would land when I started researching a family story. But the history of dissent is a wide open field, far from what most Mormon historians care to pursue. This conference has given me a chance to mull over what I have learned about Mormonism, Mormon people, and Mormon dissenters. What I see is this. In the 19th century, dissenters were treated as enemies. One was either for the church or against it. The attitude was that through some character flaw, these people had lost their way and allowed Satan to get hold of them. There was little discussion or curiosity about the doubts they had, and even less about how they might still be accepted as neighbors in spite of leaving the church. One historical example will suffice, that of John Hyde, Jr. Hyde was born in England in 1833, baptized in London in 1848 at age 15, and ordained as 70 3 years later. From 1851 to 1853, he served under John Taylor on a mission to France. After that, he emigrated to Utah, married his English sweetheart, and taught school for a living. He received his endowments in 1854. Hyde began to find things in Mormonism that distressed him. One was the mixing of the spiritual with the secular. In Great Britain, the church stressed biblical teachings and promoted discussions. Gifts of the Spirit, such as visions, were important. But in Utah, Hyde was put off by the typical meeting. Quote, "They always commence by singing in prayer, but discourse on adobe making, clothes washing, house cleaning, ditch digging, and other kindred subjects. It is no more worship than anything else they do." Hyde came to distrust the church leaders. In England, polygamy was regularly denied as a pernicious rumor. But when he got to Utah, he realized the missionaries had not told the truth. As he wrote later, quote, "The whole of the apostles abroad had lied in denying it, positively, deliberately, willfully lied, wrote lies, published and circulated lies. The heads of the church sanctioned and commanded them. What confidence can we place in the statements of such men or the pretensions of such a system?" Hyde had other complaints related to the control Brigham Young kept over individuals, as well as the practice of polygamy. The latter did not, he said, make either men or women happy or elevated. Nevertheless, it was a struggle to decide to leave the church. Quote, "Every tie that could bind anyone to any system united me to Mormonism," he wrote. It had been the religion that my youth had loved and preached. It was the faith of my parents, of my wife and her relatives. I clung to it with desperate energy. In May 1856, he accepted a mission to Hawaii because he hoped that, quote, to be actively employed in the ministry might waken up my old confidence, and that in the effort to convince others, I might succeed in reconvincing myself. In this, he failed. By the time he reached Hawaii, he was persuaded that Mormonism was in error. Back in San Francisco, where he had earlier defended polygamy, he now lectured against it, then went on to New York City, where he published his book, Mormonism, Its Leaders and Designs. His wife never joined him and eventually married another man as a plural wife in Salt Lake City. In January 1857, Hyde was excommunicated publicly in the Old Tabernacle in Salt Lake City. It held some 2,500 people, though how many attended that day is not known. In a discourse, Heber C. Kimball moved that, quote, John Hyde be cut off from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, root and branch. I want you to vote, every one of you, either for or against, for there is no sympathy to be shown unto such a man. All that are in favor that John Hyde be cut off and that he be delivered over to Satan to be buffeted in the flesh will raise their right hands. All hands were raised. This 19th century example has echoes in the recent excommunications in the church. A woman recently posted on the feminist Mormon Housewives blog saying, quote, in the church, apostasy has been neatly wrapped up in the parable of the wheat and tares. Those who apostatize must be the tares, and those left in the church pat themselves on the back for being the wheat. They see their judgments as having been sure, swift, and godly. In Googling LDS wheat and tares, I got a number of perspectives on this parable, so I don't know how representative her post is. Although those recently excommunicated were not turned over to the buffeting of Satan, she certainly felt the judgments were too harsh. How would a Catholic view this parable? Father Dan Dwyer, who is right here, in his usual generous way answered my email, quote, to me it seems that one aspect of the parable is that it is difficult to tell the wheat from tares. So rather than make a judgment, we should leave people to God's judgment. Practically speaking, that would mean that one should be very hesitant to excommunicate in case you are ripping up the wheat. Sometimes excommunication is necessary, but we need always to remember that excommunication is just that, a withholding of communion for a serious reason. It is not an action that necessarily cuts the person off from God. Only God knows when and if that ever happens. I think the parable of the wheat and the tares calls for as much inclusion as is humanly possible and has more to do with one's ultimate destiny in the kingdom than in the status of one's church membership here. One Russian Orthodox priest comments, Christ does not want the tares pulled out that grow alongside the wheat in the church because he wants the righteous to learn patience and for sinners to feel his loving kindness. Leaving the subject of dissent, let me turn to working as a Catholic in Mormon history. Early on, I decided that I did not need to carry on into yet another generation the negative views of Mormonism inherited from my father's family. Especially thanks to MHA, I have made wonderful friends who have greatly enriched my life. I respect the sincerity of their beliefs. Research has led me into corners of American history never before suspected. This formerly foreign land has thus become increasingly familiar and populated by friends. In the course of my research, I have met and talked with a number of Mormon cousins, descendants of relatives who did not leave the faith. Most were welcoming, curious to meet me, and generous with family papers or photographs that might be relevant to my work. One experience, however, was different. I had thought this set of cousins would be interested in what I had turned up about our common ancestors, but they were not. I puzzled over this for some time. Maybe I'm wrong, but I finally concluded the problem was that they did not want to let go of their picture of our ancestors. The ones they wanted were something like those in a coloring book of handcart pioneers, undaunted by any obstacle. They did not want real human beings who experienced the ups and downs of life and maybe even struggled with doubt. They seemed afraid of having their view shaken, of somehow losing their heroic forebears. I've also had some experiences which, while well-meaning, carried an edge. Several people over the years have asked if I am LDS, and when I say no, they brightly chime, "We can fix that." One woman looked puzzled when I said I was Catholic and then burst out, "But we want you." Another time, on a tour to the Cedar City Rock Chapel, an elderly friend took my hand and led me downstairs to the baptismal font. I can't remember what he said, but it was obvious that he hoped one day I'd join the faith. Yet another person told me that I might find myself walking beside a swimming pool, fall in, and find myself baptized. These people all wanted only the best for me, but each instance implied that my Catholic baptism did not really count. That's disheartening. I would hope that Mormons and Catholics could come to acknowledge and respect each other's beliefs without one feeling superior to the other. One last story. One day on an MHA post-conference tour, I sat next to Paul Anderson, now retired curator at the Museum of Art at BYU. As we chatted, I told him my theories of why the staff at the church archives were so helpful. After recounting my thoughts that Mormons are simply nice, that maybe they did not believe the truth would hurt the church, or that they hoped I'd convert, he laughed and said, "Oh, Polly, it's that you can't imagine how delighted we are to have an outsider interested in our history." I loved it, but it also reveals what distances remain between Mormon insiders and outsiders. It is better than it used to be, for Wallace Stegner's statements about Mormon history being embattled and there being no firm ground no longer hold true. Although we have come a long way, the road still stretches ahead. Hopefully over time, we, historians and ordinary folk, Mormons and non-Mormons, will be less quick to judge and will take an interest in each other's religious beliefs. And hopefully non-Mormons will go beyond the seemingly weird in Mormonism to find the underlying vibrant faith and culture. May all religions recognize that people, living or dead, are and were questioning people, for questioning, including doubting, is what humans do. Thank you.
I'm actually the Mormon among Catholics part of this equation, and as full disclosure demands, I'm also Boyd's wife. He asked me for a sort of personal reflection on my experience in graduate school. As Blair said in his introduction, I'm an associate professor of English at Brigham Young University, where I teach medieval literature. I was raised in Utah Valley. Well, I got taller in Utah Valley. And I got my undergraduate degrees from BYU and both of my graduate degrees from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. As an alumna of that school, and especially as a medievalist who studies Catholic mystics of the 13th and 14th centuries, I love Catholicism and the history of Catholic Christianity. I do confess, though, that my knowledge of that vast history is spotty and particular, and that the parts I love most about it are the wacky bits. I always loved history, and I was attracted to the high ritual of Catholicism, even as a weird Mormon kid. But I didn't expect to go to Catholic school, so here is how that happened. One of the ways that God has always answered my prayers is through music. Sorry, I lost my place. When my father died, I spent hours listening to his favorite records of classical music to help with my grief. I've had questions resolved by overheard snatches of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, and I have had little epiphanies, or as I call them, epiphanettes. By recalling seemingly random song lyrics, they pop into my head fortuitously, and God and I share a chuckle. But probably the most poignant time God answered a prayer with a song was when I was a new graduate student at the University of Maryland. I didn't start out at Catholic U. I was terribly homesick. Boyd and I were married for about 4 years and had never lived outside of Utah before. We moved to Maryland at the new year, which meant unpacking our van full of belongings into a tiny basement apartment during a cold snap harsher than any Maryland had experienced in years. We moved into the basement because it was all that we could afford, and though it was adequate, a kitchen, a bathroom, it also had 2 unforeseen aspects that did not help my loneliness and depression. The first was that the foundation of the house was severely cracked, which meant we awoke each morning to about an inch of icy water on the floor. And Mrs. Cook, the landlady, who was bedridden in the final stages of aggressive and agonizing stomach cancer. She would cry out in distress and pain and then chain smoke to take some of the edge off. Our bed was about 6 feet below hers. Her distress, as well as the tobacco and medical waste smells, would fill our tiny, splashy bedroom in all hours that she was awake, which was most of them. Dying of cancer is not for the faint of heart. And I was in a completely inappropriate slough of self-pity, as she did. My depression was fierce. I had been the darling of my graduating class at BYU. All the professors knew me and loved me. And here I was, a total stranger at an enormous state school with professors who drank coffee and smoked cigarettes and did not care at all about the new grad student who paid out-of-state tuition and looked bewildered more often than not. They weren't unkind particularly, but they were not my people, as my BYU professors had been my people. And where I thought school itself could give me a purpose and a distraction from my homesickness, at the University of Maryland it merely exacerbated the longing. There was no financial aid or teaching assignment for me, so the financial sacrifice was shared out among student loans and parental help, master dad funding, and I felt guilty about that too. Through the despair of that winter, what I most craved was light. I had to get work as soon as possible. Boyd was on a political internship, which had a laughably small stipend, so I worked for a temporary agency at a variety of unsavory odd jobs, all of which seem in my memory to be very dingy and dark places. The sun was hidden behind dull clouds for all of those months. Our basement had no windows, and my graduate school classes were all at night, since I had to work days. I never seemed to find any light. So I begged for it. One particularly gloomy evening before Boyd called from the metro station for a ride, I begged God for some light, any light. And instantly, loudly, joyfully, into my head popped a song, the hymn, "The Lord is my light." By day and by night, his presence is near. I could use that. I was not forgotten. I had just forgotten who the light really was. Like the medieval mystics I was in school to study, I had to remember to replace my sadness with the light of his assurance. I lived off that hymn for days. The sun didn't come out, and Mrs. Cook still shouted for release. But with that song in my head, I started to climb out of my depression, and I was able to go to her, to hold her hand, to make useless but distracting small talk with her, without caving into my own despair. One day, about a week after this small but crucial epiphanet, I ventured out of our new environs to get myself lost. I had learned how to drive to the essential places, grocery stores, school, work, the metro station, but driving until lost and then finding my way home. But on this day, I went to get lost on public transit. I needed to learn how to find my way home even without a car. So I put as much money as I could on a metro ticket, and I simply got on and began riding. I changed lines from orange to green to blue to red, and I got out at various stops, never going through the stiles, just to check my surroundings, except for one. One stop on the red line was labeled Brookland CUA. I didn't know what that stood for, but I decided to get out there. CUA stands for the Catholic University of America. I took the elevator out of the metro and emerged onto a campus with what looked for all the world to me like a castle. Next to a Byzantine dome near an English country manor house, University of Maryland was beautiful as a campus, but it is quintessentially American, all Georgian and colonial, and this was medieval. This was the Catholic University of America, not merely a Catholic university in America. I was entranced. Even in the grim eastern winter, the campus of CUA was lovely. There were buildings with crenellations. There was the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. I wandered into the bookstore, and there was the university's banner, with a shield blazoned with the cross, Mary's crescent moon in the upper left quadrant, and a book lying open in the center inscribed with the words, Deus mea lux est. And I burst into tears. God was my light, a refrain my sanity had depended on for a week, and here he had led me to a home I hadn't known existed. I visited the admissions office. I went to the English department. Within another term, they had not only accepted my transfer from University of Maryland, but had also put me to work in the Writing Center and waived my tuition. Though no school experience is halcyon and perfect, I am positive Catholic U was the best place for me to get my degrees. I made friends who are still in my life. I had a brilliant dissertation director, whom I affectionately referred to as Dr. Ego, completing the trio of Doctors Id and Superego, and it launched me into a career that I love. I was already enamored of much of medieval Catholic history, but now I had risen to owe allegiance and gratitude to contemporary Catholicism as well. I hadn't had much exposure to it growing up in Provo. My sister's best friend in her 4th grade year had been the only Catholic in our elementary school. And the teacher, not just the students, of that 4th grade class had told my sister privately not to befriend a non-Mormon. This made us all swell with indignation and loyalty, and we became fiercely attached to her. But I never learned anything about Catholicism from Joan, except not to actually swear during grace before meals. She got in trouble for that. She forgot the words and said, "Damn it, it's not what you want on your food." My experience of being Mormon at CUA was relatively unremarkable academically. Though it is the pontifical flagship, the in the title is a very big deal, and it's the only U.S. school to receive direct Vatican funding and require papal imprimatur for some of its approved dissertations. It was not at all Catholic the same way BYU is Mormon, so it was outside of my experience that way too. It is in many of the same categories as a religious school as BYU is, but it is a lot more ecumenical, at least for the graduate students. And I will say that the religious element was a welcome relief for me. At University of Maryland, I did not know where the boundaries were with discussion that might verge into the religious, which is hard when the texts you want to study are mystical. But at Catholic U, almost all the faculty and students were religious and respectful of religion, even if it was something other than Roman Catholicism. The classmates I am still closest to are Evangelical Lutheran, Anglican Episcopalian, Methodist, and Neo-Pagan. He reads my tarot for me at medieval studies conferences. Our conversations about medieval Catholic texts were very, very rich. The undergraduate students there were also religiously disciplined and understandably reverential toward conservative religious views, but many also hankered for a sense of the university experience of independence and breakaway thinking. While I was there, they demanded, for instance, a gay student club, which no one was willing to join, and free distribution of condoms, which few were willing to pick up during hours of high visibility. Their strident graffiti demands for these radical ideas were all done in chalk. The students wanted freedom and sexual safety and justice, and not to lose their scholarship. It was bold for CUA in the 90s and would have been expellable offense at BYU, but CUA undergraduate rebels struck a cautious, hilarious balance. Equal rights for gays, not that I know any of them. The faculty were varied. One of the four Catholics on the English faculty when I was there, of the 4 Catholics on the English faculty when I was there, one was gay himself, though of the generation to refer to himself with a twinkle in his eye as a confirmed bachelor. One was a sister whose life's work was the Protestant Tyndale Bible. One was raised Catholic, but was very proud of his Mormon heritage. As a small boy, he had participated in the 1947 centennial reenactment of the pioneer entry into Utah. And the last was a staunchly Catholic Irishman. On learning I was Mormon, he was the only one to comment, "Mormon, oh, that's a little baby religion, and with a lay priesthood too, how cute." My dissertation committee consisted of only one Catholic from the church history department, who was a fiercely feminist Benedictine nun, Sister Mary, that would be Dr. Superego. One Unitarian Universalist, Dr. Ego, and I'd thank God for him, but that's a bit anthropomorphic for his taste. And Dr. Id, a gay alcoholic pantheist, son of a bitterly lapsed Mormon. Not the same one as participated in the Days of 47 festival either. Another thing that would not have happened at BYU was the preponderance of interruptions we got for saints' feasts and other holy days. We graduate instructors would fight each other to teach the Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedules, the plum courses being in the middle of the day because that's when school masses would always be held at the shrine. I knew I had really acclimated to Catholic education when I caught myself staring, brow furrowed, at the word strawberry written out in all capitals and wondering vaguely which one was St. Rawberry. By only our second year, my grad school class friends and I began to refer to all of March as St. Patrick's Month. It was a wash. Spring break was only supposed to last a week, but I learned that some people can squeeze a lot more out of a liturgical calendar than you'd think. I suspect it involves trumping up some bogus family devotional saints, possibly St. Rawberry. Certain school administrators and the students' wealthy families managed to stretch the Cancun vacations out to 2 weeks, and then St. Patrick's happened, which they never scheduled to coincide with spring break. It was its own week-and-a-half celebration. To make it worse, those unlucky undergraduates who did, because of family poverty and/or cruelty, find themselves on campus in March would drink green beer, which flowed from Kitty O'Shea's taps at a penny a pint starting on about the 10th, into absolute oblivion. One year, when St. Patrick's fell on a Monday, a group in my writing class convinced one of their members, a particularly prodigious drinker, that Wednesday was really Friday and that he had drunk and slept his way past the quizzes for that week. I was never questioned about my religion outside of the box I ticked on the admissions NRC instead of RC, except for once, and then it wasn't so much my religion as my perceived piety. In my second year, I got pregnant, and I was in the first queasy months and carrying food in my pockets to keep my stomach calm. I was taking an evening class on the York Corpus Christi plays, which are biblical reenactments. And because of my Mormon upbringing and BYU education, I'm sure, I had gotten a reputation for being the go-to Bible person. During break one night, the class clown passed me in the hall as I munched my crackers and carrots, and he sneered, "Actual food? I thought you subsisted entirely on Holy Eucharist." I blinked at him. "I'm pregnant, Mike. I'm just fighting the queasiness. Plus, I'm not even Catholic." Now it was his turn to blink. "You're not Catholic?" He finally broke into a wide smile and said, "Of course. If you were Catholic and pregnant, you'd be dropping out of school." After that, we were fast friends. I guess it wasn't obnoxiously pious to know the Bible if it was the King James Version. So I didn't have the same kinds of pressure on me to join up that poor Polly has had among her Mormon friends. Catholics are a grown-up religion, not as cynically grown-up as Judaism, perhaps, but not insecure and needy either. Mormonism is a baby religion comparatively, and it's still in its puppy phase, licking people's faces and begging for anyone to like us and play with us now. Now! There was only one time I felt like an outsider for not being Catholic, and that was during a homily in one of the weekday masses, when the priest made an adamant point that one flock and one shepherd meant this flock in this specific brand of Roman Catholicism that he was preaching and no other. Straight was the gate and narrow was the way in his speech, and he made it clear that no one, not I nor anyone else, who did not follow his lead was on that path or going through that gate without his approval. It didn't feel good, as I figure it doesn't feel good for Polly. One of the things I found out myself during my years at Catholic U was I found myself forming an ongoing mental parallel between the major events of early Christian history and specific Mormon history. It's an urge born probably from my family's affection for seeing connections and parallels, but mine are usually useless. Nevertheless, I still find myself doing it and tripping up when someone other than me has done it too, as when I heard Terrell Givens label the Pratt boys, Parley and Orson, as serving for our Augustine, shaping Catholicism's mystical and miraculous beginnings into a praxis and an orthodoxy, which I had wondered about, but not so much as I had seen, for instance, the parallels with the split with the community of Christ as the schism with the Eastern Orthodoxy, and the Avignon papacy as perhaps the claims of Sidney Rigdon. Oh, I found myself on a roll. David O. McKay was our Innocent III, and the 1950s correlation was the Fourth Lateran Council. Those early years-long missions were a kind of monasticism. Though we didn't have the Eremitic tradition of hermits and anchors, we eventually did get our MTC Cenobites and Jesuits when Gene England founded Dialogue. I could go interesting places with the Spanish Inquisition, but I won't, though I will mention Brigham's godless American government and its persecution of the Mormons as America's Armageddon scenario speech, and the condemnation of President Grant in connection with the investiture controversy, which is probably a stretch. There were moral failings and financial shenanigans in both histories, hagiographies of great examples and martyrs, and a pilgrimage growth industry, rogue bishops to rein in both traditions, uppity women, brilliant orators and philosophers, and at least a promise of some cultural or literary Miltons and Shakespeares as yet to emerge. We haven't yet had an individual figure, I think, to parallel Martin Luther that I can tell, though I think there are probably far too many who would love to claim that function and label for themselves. But I do think we had our Henry VIII, and I think it was Brigham Young. Not that the complex and specific English Protestant break with Rome under Henry has exact parallels, as any of these do, with the complex and specific reasons for the exodus and defection of the Mormon saints from the USA. But rather that Brigham, like Henry, was a leader with enormous ego, strident insistence on his own infallibility, certain outrageous bigotries, lots of wives, and an empire to run his way. For good or ill, England would never become the England it is without Henry, and Mormonism and the Jello Belt would not have developed into what they are without Brother Brigham. For good or ill, or both, Henry shaped a possibility for religious nationalism the world had never seen before him. And for good or ill, or both, Brigham Young shaped Mormonism into a people unlike anything the world has seen either. And I would contend that both groups could use a solid 12-step program. In fact, I've thought frequently that the reason the millennium is 1,000 years long is that that's how long family therapy is going to take, even with Jesus as a facilitator. The CUA professor who called Mormonism a baby religion was more right than he knew, I think. It may be a baby with a claim to revelation and restoration. It may be a baby because it's simply valuable for existing. But it was neither born nor brought up in a vacuum. The burned-over district of 19th century New England was burnt over in Protestant sibling rivalry, but all of those quarreling brother and sister denominations at least agreed that they despised and disowned their papal Roman ancestor. Joseph Smith famously defended Catholicism when typical Protestant anti-Catholic sentiment crept into early Mormons' rhetoric. As Joan's friend when I was a kid and as a student of CUA later, I seized on that quote, even having grown up hearing Bruce R. McConkie's identification of Catholicism with the great and abominable church. I teach Joseph Smith's repudiation of McConkie at BYU, and I find my Mormon students there becoming increasingly appreciative of Catholicism and its rich heritage themselves. I felt and still feel drawn toward this intimidatingly well-established, grown-up great-grandparent of my own faith, and especially of the mystical voices within it. Toddlers can indeed be cute, as my professor said, but they can also make really stupid choices and be unpredictably cranky, throwing tantrums and embarrassing onlookers as they test boundaries and establish their own identities. To take the analogy further, children will always have both some attractive and some unattractive features and qualities of their predecessors, as well as having their own unique qualities and gifts, attractive or not, as this conference has already made fiercely apparent. Even though I am thoroughly Mormon, I will always maintain a crypto-Catholic identity that comes from my alma mater. I will continue to love, study, teach, and revel in the history of Christianity and the history of Mormonism. I will always feel great affection toward my Catholic brothers and sisters, and the lay folks too. Thank you.